Hey everyone, and welcome back to another dive into the past. The pursuit of beauty has always demanded a price, but for the average person in the Middle Ages, that price was often the slow loss of their health, all for a simple, gleaming white. The highborn and the lowborn across medieval Europe shared one non-negotiable beauty standard: skin as pale as fresh snow. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a socio-economic broadcast, a quiet signal understood immediately by everyone from the peasant in the field to the lord in his castle. In the complex visual language of the medieval world, a sun-kissed complexion was code for one thing: labor. It meant hours spent outside, under the relentless, uncaring gaze of the sun, farming, fetching water, or hauling goods at the marketplace. A tanned face was the unmistakable uniform of the working poor. Conversely, skin so white it was almost translucent was the immediate proof of leisure. It showed the world that you were indoor people, shielded from the elements, with no need to soil your hands or your face with honest toil. This was the ultimate, effortless status symbol, and the goal of a forgotten daily ritual for millions. This relentless fixation on whiteness created a fascinating social tension. The peasant woman, often barely scraping by, was obsessed with hiding the very evidence of the work that kept her alive. The desire to look like you did absolutely nothing was profound, and it drove a desperate market. Think of it as the original high-stakes filter. The challenge for the common person, of course, was logistics. For the very wealthy, the solution was simple: stay inside. Their lives were conducted primarily within the stone walls of their manors and castles. But for the vast majority of the population, life was lived outdoors. To survive, you had to be outside. To look wealthy, you had to look like you were never outside. This required serious, dedicated effort. The wealthy had elaborate routines involving expensive imported oils and, critically, the leisure time to let those routines work. The average person did not have that luxury. They needed quick, cheap, and immediately effective solutions to rewind a day's worth of sun exposure. This is where medieval ingenuity and some truly questionable science stepped in. The kitchen, or the small fire pit of the average cottage, became a clandestine beauty laboratory. Everyday ingredients were repurposed with reckless enthusiasm. The goal was simple: exfoliate, strip, and lighten. And the two most common acids available for these tasks were vinegar and lemon juice. These were applied directly, mixed into simple flour pastes, or boiled down to create powerful, stinging astringents. But wait, this is where things get a little more eccentric. The highborn might use imported rosewater or expensive almond milk. The commoner often turned to something far more pungent and readily available: stale urine. Urine contains ammonia, a powerful natural bleaching and cleansing agent. Before modern chemistry, this was one of the most effective compounds available for lifting stains and lightening the skin. It was used in laundry, and yes, it was dabbed onto faces. The smell was temporary, but the whiteness, however brief, was worth the grimace. This daily ritual was a small, quiet act of rebellion against their social station. It was a literal attempt to scrub away their class, a desperate hope to briefly wear the uniform of the leisure class, even if only for a Sunday service or a market day. The constant application of these acidic or ammonia-rich compounds did achieve the desired effect. It stripped the outer layers of skin, giving the face a temporary, sickly white glow. But the medieval beauty regimen was not just about washing. It was also about coating. When the washes failed to fully erase the sun, an active camouflage was required. This was the birth of the common person's makeup. They could not afford the finely ground imported pigments used by the aristocracy, which often included mercury or lead.
Instead, the everyday woman turned to what was available: chalk, finely ground flour, or simple pipe clay. These were mixed with a little animal fat or oil to create a thick, opaque paste. This white layer was then heavily applied to the face, neck, and sometimes the hands. The look was striking, often appearing unnaturally stark, but it successfully obscured the sun-darkened skin underneath. It was a crude, heavy-duty foundation designed not to enhance, but to obliterate. The tragic irony here is that while the commoner avoided the most toxic compounds of the elite, their cheap, rough versions of beauty aids were still deeply corrosive. The chalk and clay dried the skin horribly, while the constant application of vinegar and urine left the face perpetually inflamed and vulnerable. The skin, desperate to recover, would often become irritated and red, requiring even more thick white paste to cover the damage. This constant application of rough homemade pastes led to another social dilemma. A commoner's face, coated in this cheap makeshift makeup, could not withstand the rigors of an outdoor workday. The pastes would run, crack, and flake under the sweat and grime of labor. Therefore, the daily application of the white mask became a secret indoor habit, often applied just before a public appearance and then scrubbed off immediately upon returning home. It was a borrowed face worn for a precious hour. This intense, daily chemical assault, the constant stripping and coating, left its mark. The pale complexion was achieved, but it came at the expense of a rapidly aging, fragile, and often weeping skin barrier. The commoner was not just covering up the sun's work, they were slowly, painfully eroding the health of their own skin in a strange, silent sacrifice. And yet, the habit persisted. This was the ultimate social currency, a visible demonstration of a dream, the dream of a life lived without the burden of the sun, without the exhausting weight of labor. The medieval person understood that in their society, visibility was destiny. To look pale was to look like someone who mattered, someone who was served rather than one who served. They would pay the price in comfort and health, all for that fleeting, snow-white moment of assumed status. It makes you wonder which of our own everyday, seemingly innocent habits today is quietly costing us the most.
The pursuit of whiteness was an indoor job, but the reality for most working people was an existence rooted firmly, permanently in the sun. The medieval obsession with paleness was a constant battle against the brutal reality of life outside the castle walls. For the highborn, their skin was a protected commodity. For the lowborn, it was an occupational hazard. The reality for most working people was a life spent in the sun, in the fields, at the market, or tending animals. A tan or even a dark complexion was the unmistakable mark of common labor, and therefore low status. This wasn't a fashion trend, it was a societal iron law. Your skin color was a permanent, nonverbal resume, and it said, very clearly, this person earns their bread with sweat. Imagine the stark visual contrast. The noblewoman gliding through a darkened hall, her skin untouched by a single ray of sunlight. And then the peasant woman, spending 10 hours a day bent over a furrow, her face weathered, her hands calloused, her complexion deepened by the relentless summer heat. One was associated with soft fabrics and imported spices, the other with mud and manual exertion. In a society fixated on rigid social hierarchy, this visual difference was everything. The sun in this context was not a source of vitamin D or healthy glow. It was an enemy. It was the agent of social humiliation. Every single day was a calculated exposure, a slow, inevitable darkening that cemented their place at the bottom of the ladder. But wait, the absurdity of this beauty standard is heightened by the sheer necessity of the sun-tanned life. Unlike the modern economy, the medieval economy was almost entirely out of doors. You couldn't just clock in to a climate-controlled office to avoid the sun. The baker had to fetch the wood. The weaver had to manage the sheep. The brewer had to collect the hops. The vast infrastructure of medieval life was built on physical proximity to the natural world. No one was safe from the sun's reach. This meant the simple daily task of getting water from the well was a beauty risk. Walking the mile to the market was a risk. Even sitting in the shadow of a thatched roof offered only minimal protection from the light that bounced off the dusty ground. The sun was inescapable, a kind of natural class enforcer. This constant exposure required an entire unspoken culture of coping mechanisms. While the goal was to look like they never left the manor, the practical reality demanded utilitarian defense. Wide-brim hats were not just for blocking rain, they were the first, cheapest line of defense against social ruin. Women would wrap their heads and necks in linen veils, leaving only a small portion of the face exposed. These coverings were less about modesty and more about minimizing the evidence of their labor. The clothing itself was often thick and heavy, not just for warmth, but for coverage. Long sleeves and high necklines were non-negotiable, even on the hottest days. This must have been a miserable experience, sweating profusely under layers of heavy fabric, but the alternative was a telltale tan that marked them publicly. It was a choice between physical discomfort and social invisibility. The real challenge came for the hands. Unlike the face, which could be covered or painted, the hands were the unfiltered storytellers of their working lives. Hands were constantly engaged, pulling rope, kneading dough, milking, chopping wood. Their skin was perpetually darkened and thickened, and so the hands became a second target for the aggressive cleansing routines described earlier, the harsh acids and the ammonia-rich washes. But the medieval person knew that these measures were often losing battles. The sun was simply too powerful, so a new, more aggressive defensive strategy was sometimes employed: strategic indoor labor. Where possible, tasks were pulled inside. If a peasant could shell beans or repair tools within the dim light of their cottage, they would. This was not always for comfort, it was for the preservation of their complexion. The darkest, dustiest corners of the home became havens against the sun, even if it meant squinting and risking eye strain. The dimness itself became a status simulator. This whole practice reveals a profound contradiction. The sun gave them life. It grew their crops, it dried their wood, it powered their day. Yet it simultaneously threatened their only form of social aspiration. To escape the sun was to escape the definition of their own poverty. The tan was the tattoo of the commoner, and they spent their lives trying to laser it off with kitchen chemicals. And this constant fight for surface-level paleness only set the stage for the next inevitable step. The desperate desire to look untouched by the sun eventually led them directly into the arms of the one thing that could truly deliver a terrifying, permanent whiteness. The chemical cost was about to get much, much steeper. The pale complexion was a goal so essential, people were willing to ingest or apply the kind of ingredients that today we wouldn't let near our skin.
The sun was the medieval enemy, and the acidic household washes were just the opening salvo in the battle for paleness. When simple remedies failed, the common person became willing to engage in a far more dangerous transaction. The relentless pressure to appear untouched by labor meant that the desperate search for whiteness soon outgrew the kitchen cupboard. This simple desire for a lighter complexion led to a surprising market for dangerous goods. From expensive imports to common household toxins, the medieval person would use almost anything to erase the sun. For centuries, the quest for white skin was one of history's most reliable economic drivers, creating a supply chain dedicated entirely to superficial, short-term vanity. This system operated on a spectrum of risk, from the expensive aristocratic poisons to the cheap, readily available dangers of the common market. The elite, those who could genuinely afford to be pale, often used elaborate preparations containing toxic heavy metals. Their beauty secret was basically slow poisoning, a testament to the idea that status was worth the self-inflicted damage. But what did the average person, the working class, obsessed with mimicking that look, do when they couldn't afford imported Venetian ceruse or fine alabaster powder? They got creative. They turned to the less regulated, more accessible hazards of their own environment. This is where the story of medieval beauty becomes a terrifying chapter in forgotten chemistry. Lye, an extremely caustic substance created by mixing wood ashes and water, was a crucial part of soap making. It was a potent, skin-stripping irritant, and yet, when highly diluted, or in many tragic cases, not diluted enough, it was sometimes used as a powerful skin lightener. The thinking was simple. If it can strip grime from cloth, it can certainly strip color from skin. This was the medieval equivalent of using industrial degreaser as a facial cleanser. It gave a temporarily glowing whiteness, but left the skin inflamed, raw, and vulnerable to every minor infection. Then there were the internal remedies. The medieval diet was often focused on herbs and roots, many of which had mild to severe side effects. Certain preparations were believed to purify the blood, which was, in the strange logic of the time, linked to lightening the complexion. These concoctions were often powerful diuretics or emetics, substances that forced the body to expel fluids. The desired effect was a sickly, washed-out look that was easily mistaken for aristocratic pallor. The actual effect was dehydration and mineral depletion. But wait. The pursuit of the perfect white eventually led the common person, either through accidental discovery or sheer desperation, toward the quiet terror of mineral compounds. They couldn't afford pure lead, but they could access common substances that contained it. Ground gypsum, often used in construction or plasterwork, was cheap and plentiful. When mixed with water or oil, it created a stark white paste that was an excellent opaque base for makeup. The long-term problem was that these common mineral dusts were frequently contaminated with other trace elements. More alarmingly, the common dye trade provided another source of chemical danger. Certain pigments used to dye textiles a bright, rich white were also repurposed for the face. These pigments were often derived from metal oxides, designed to be durable and opaque. When ground finely and mixed into a paste, they gave the desired, startling whiteness. The user was essentially painting their face with industrial-grade paint, hoping the chemicals would stay external. The chemical cost was a quiet one. The damage didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, cumulative deterioration. Every day, the skin absorbed a tiny amount of lye residue, a minuscule trace of metal, or the constant dehydrating burn of strong acid. Over weeks, months, and years, this constant exposure led to chronic irritation, discoloration, and a loss of skin elasticity. It gave the appearance of premature aging, a truly counterproductive result. The absurdity is that the pursuit of youth and status through a pale complexion actually resulted in the opposite, a brittle, prematurely aged face that required increasingly heavy applications of dangerous paste to conceal the damage. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of vanity and self-harm. The irony of the medieval beauty routine is that the very things they used to erase the evidence of their hard life often created a new, far more distressing problem. The beautiful white mask they wore was concealing a terrifying internal consequence. The common people of the Middle Ages were unknowingly conducting a grand, slow-motion experiment on themselves, all in service of a single, gleamingly white status symbol. The subtle damage of these daily habits would eventually reveal the truth far darker than a simple tan.
The pursuit of a light complexion was a daily sacrifice,
But for the average person, the expensive toxic imports were simply out of reach. They had to look closer to home, often finding their harsh beauty aids in the pantry, or worse. For the everyday person, the pursuit of paleness often began with bizarre, low-cost household remedies. These were the go-to skincare solutions, simple substances with powerful, often overlooked chemical properties. Diluted vinegar and lemon juice were commonly used as primitive bleaching agents. This was not a pleasant, scented spa ritual. It was a practical, stinging application of household acids. Vinegar, made easily from fermented grains or fruit, was one of the most accessible acidic substances in the medieval home. It was a disinfectant, a preservative, and, in the hands of the desperate, a DIY chemical peel. Lemon juice, when available, was even more prized for its potent citric acid. Both liquids worked by gently, or sometimes not so gently, stripping the outer tanned layers of the skin. The goal was rapid exfoliation, forcing the body to reveal the paler, newer skin underneath. The stinging sensation after application was interpreted not as damage, but as the substance working, a sign that the sun's work was being undone. The women who engaged in this daily acid wash were essentially using the cheapest, least refined chemicals available. They were trading temporary discomfort for the precious visual status of paleness. It was a risky game of chance, just enough acid to lighten, but not enough to cause permanent scarring. But the medieval person's ingenuity for unconventional beauty didn't stop at acidic foodstuffs. When they needed something stronger, something that could really cut through the grime of a working life and the darkening effect of the sun, they turned to a substance that modern society politely flushes away. The most potent, readily available source of ammonia was fermented human urine. Ammonia is a natural bleaching agent and a powerful cleaner. Historically, it was used by fullers, the people who cleaned and treated wool, because of its impressive ability to strip dirt, grease, and discoloration from fabric. And if it worked wonders on cloth, the logic followed, why not on skin? A slightly aged pot of urine contained high concentrations of ammonia, created as the urea broke down. This was sometimes employed as a powerful, if profoundly unpleasant, ammonia-rich wash. It sounds utterly repulsive, and by modern standards, it absolutely is. But in a world devoid of effective, safe cleansing products, this substance was seen as a potent natural tool. It was used to wash hands, to clean blemishes, and, critically, to lighten the face. The ritual itself was a testament to the sheer dedication demanded by the beauty standard. This was not a routine performed openly. The collection, storage, and application of this particular wash were secret acts, carried out in the private, dim corners of the home. The smell would have been overpowering, requiring immediate follow-up with scented herbs or flower water to mask the lingering evidence of the procedure. Think about the sheer mental effort required to overcome the instinctual revulsion. The desire for whiteness had to completely outweigh the desire for basic hygiene and pleasantness. It shows just how deeply embedded this social rule was. To risk the smell, to endure the sting, all for the hope of looking slightly less like a peasant. Yet this bizarre wash wasn't used only for bleaching. The ammonia also acted as an incredibly strong cleanser, dissolving the cheap, heavy, fat-based makeup pastes that were used to cover the face. It was a one-two punch, cleansing and bleaching in a single noxious application. But wait, there was a constant, unseen problem with these DIY chemical routines. The strength of these substances was completely unregulated. The concentration of acid in homebrewed vinegar varied wildly. The potency of the ammonia in the urine wash depended on diet and fermentation time. This meant that the medieval person was essentially engaging in a blind, daily titration experiment on their own face. One day the wash might be gentle. The next, it might be fiercely corrosive. The result was a skin surface that was perpetually compromised. The natural oils were stripped away, the protective barrier was dissolved, and the face was left red, tender, and permanently irritated. This was the foundation upon which they then applied rough, chalk-based makeup. It was a layer of cheap cosmetic applied to a field of chemical burns. The commoner, in their desperate pursuit of the aristocratic look, had turned their own household into a source of constant, low-grade chemical trauma. This forgotten, smelly, and painful ritual reveals the true lengths people will go to when society decrees that their natural state is unacceptable. The daily wash was a quiet declaration of war against the sun, but it was the skin itself that paid the ultimate price. The face was now ready for the next layer of deception.
The daily acid and ammonia wash was a brutal attempt to strip away the sun's influence, but the lingering redness and irritation meant the skin still didn't look truly aristocratic. The time for chemical warfare was over. Now it was time for camouflage. When washes failed, makeup became essential. The pursuit of paleness transitioned from a slow, painful process of exfoliation to a simple, heavy-handed act of covering up. The face needed to be whitewashed, permanently reset to a tone that signaled wealth and inactivity. This is where the class divide in medieval cosmetics becomes startlingly clear. The aristocracy had access to Venetian ceruse, a finely powdered white lead mixed with vinegar. It was deadly, yes, but it provided a smooth, lasting, and flawless matte finish. It was the original high-end foundation, a luxurious, slow poison. The average person simply could not afford this. They needed opacity, they needed volume, and they needed cheap raw materials. So they turned to the most common white substances available in their environment, creating what we can only call budget body filler. The average person did not use the sophisticated mercury-based compounds of the aristocracy, but rather rough ground mixtures of chalk, flour, or even white lead powder to achieve the desired effect. Flour, the base of all life, was often the primary ingredient. Cheap and readily available, it could be mixed with water or, more commonly, animal fat or lard to create a simple, thick paste. This mixture provided a basic layer of whiteness, but it came with the host of practical problems. It was crumbly, it absorbed sweat instantly, and most embarrassingly, it was a literal food source, often attracting insects or going sour quickly in the heat. To address the texture and staying power, they often mixed in ground chalk. Chalk, or common gypsum plaster, provided the necessary opacity and a better texture. It was rough, yes, and applied with a thick hand, the finished face often looked more like a poorly rendered statue than a noblewoman. But it was white, and in the medieval world, that was the only quality that mattered. But wait! Even the commoner couldn't resist the allure of the powerful, professional-grade white. Despite being officially off-limits due to cost and safety, white lead powder still found its way into the common person's routine. It wasn't the finely refined ceruse, but rather cheaper, industrial-grade white lead used by painters or available through less scrupulous apothecaries. It was mixed, sometimes accidentally, into their flour and chalk pastes. The benefit of lead was undeniable. It provided unparalleled coverage, adhered better than flour, and gave a stunning, lasting pallor. This was the medieval equivalent of using house paint as makeup. The women who used it understood at some level that the material was harsh, but the result was so effective, the promise of higher status so intoxicating that the risk was rationalized. A little tingling was just the color setting. The final effect of this commoner's beauty routine was one of heavy, almost sculptural whiteness. There was no attempt at a natural, blended look. The face was clearly covered, the texture was visible, and the starkness of the white against their natural features created a visual effect that seems almost theatrical to modern eyes. This heavy application was necessary because the makeup had to hide more than just a tan. It had to hide the perpetual redness and blemishes caused by the harsh daily washes. The commoner was essentially using rough, opaque materials to cover up the damage caused by corrosive chemicals, all in the service of a single, elusive aesthetic. The true artistry in the medieval commoner's beauty routine was not in the application, but in the ingenuity of their ingredient sourcing. They were forced to be master scavengers, repurposing construction material and pantry staples into a status symbol. They were turning a rough, dirty reality into a gleaming, if brittle, facade of leisure. It makes you think about how many of our own status symbols today are simply repurposed materials or chemicals that come with a hidden high cost. The face was now undeniably white, the goal achieved. But this victory came with a hidden price tag, a slow internal clock set ticking the moment the paste dried. The beautiful facade was concealing a deep, creeping calamity.
The white paste was applied. The illusion of status was complete. But this cosmetic triumph masked a deeper, slower tragedy unfolding beneath the surface. The price of beauty, once paid in time and stinging washes, was now being paid in life itself. The continuous, unmeasured use of these rudimentary cosmetics, particularly the lead-based pastes that were tragically effective, carried a silent, creeping consequence. The relentless pursuit of paleness had moved beyond mere irritation and into the realm of systemic failure. For centuries, people knew that the best white pigments contained lead. It was a known occupational hazard for painters and potters. But the beauty industry, even in its most primitive form, offered a unique ability to ignore those inconvenient facts. The effectiveness of the white lead, even the cheap industrial-grade version used by commoners, was simply too compelling to resist. It stayed put. It covered everything. It gave that perfect, ghostly white glow. The medieval woman engaging in this daily ritual was not instantly poisoned. This wasn't a quick, dramatic, cinematic death. This was far more insidious. This was a slow, cumulative exposure, where a tiny amount of the toxic element was absorbed through the skin, day after day, year after year. A slow metallic shadow was falling across the pursuit of beauty. The problem with lead is that the body cannot easily expel it. It accumulates. It builds up in the soft tissues and, critically, in the bones. The early symptoms of this silent poisoning were often completely mistaken for other ailments. General fatigue? Must be hard work. Headaches? Everyone gets headaches. Mood swings? Just a stressful life. But the symptoms of chronic lead exposure were also perfectly designed to camouflage themselves as the very things the woman was trying to cover up. The first visible sign of the metal's toxicity was often a further deterioration of the skin. The lead powder applied to the face would clog pores and trigger more blemishes and rashes. As the poisoning progressed, the complexion often developed a strange, sickly gray or yellowish undertone, a stark contradiction to the desired white. And what was the medieval solution to the gray skin and new blemishes caused by the white makeup? More white makeup. This was the ultimate cosmetic catch-22. The cure was now the cause. The more the face darkened or blemished due to the toxic exposure, the heavier the application of lead-containing paste became. They were using poison to hide the effects of poison. But wait, the damage was far more than skin deep. The cumulative lead began to affect the nervous system, and the visible effects became tragic. One of the telltale, forgotten symptoms of chronic lead exposure is facial pallor caused by anemia, combined with a strange muscular wasting that can lead to a look of perpetual thinness and delicacy. This was, ironically, the very look of aristocratic frailty the common women were trying to achieve. They were succeeding, but through a mechanism of slow disease rather than genuine leisure. Then came the dental issues. Lead can cause the gums to recede, leading to painful sores and famously the lead line, a thin, dark, purplish or blue-black line along the gums. This line was a visible chemical signature of their toxic beauty regimen. For those who didn't lose their teeth entirely, this dark, discolored gum line was a devastating flaw that would then necessitate even more opaque, heavily applied makeup to hide the lower part of the face. The psychological toll was also severe. Lead toxicity can lead to irritability, severe abdominal pain, and cognitive fog. The beautiful, pale woman of society might be experiencing profound internal agony, all hidden behind a carefully constructed, chalky white mask. This chemical calamity was a quiet, generational problem. The subtle damage of the daily wash and the powdered paste was not understood as poisoning, but simply as ill health or the natural wear and tear of a hard life. No one connected the white paste to the stomach cramps, the irritability, or the slowly failing skin. The aristocracy might have used a more refined poison, but the commoners' crude, unmeasured use of contaminated, cheap white pigments created a far more volatile, destructive cocktail. The pursuit of paleness was not just a symbol of status. It became a slow-motion contract signed with oblivion. The medieval woman won the visual battle against the sun, but the cost was the slow surrender of her health. Her face was perfectly white, but the ticking clock of metal accumulation had already begun its dark work.
The face was a canvas of brilliant, dangerous white, a desperate statement of status. But a stark white face demands contrast, and in the logic of medieval beauty, the perfect contrast wasn't achieved with color, but with the total absence of it, specifically in the mouth. While the face was whitened, an opposing trend sometimes took hold. The human obsession with status often means that one obsession necessitates its exact opposite. To make the white skin look even whiter, the eye needed a point of profound darkness to gauge the difference. In certain non-European cultures, and even occasionally as an obscure trend in the Middle Ages, the teeth were deliberately blackened to enhance the contrast of the face's paleness. This practice, known as ohaguro in Japan, or by various names across Southeast Asia, was not simply a beauty fad. It was a complex cultural marker, symbolizing maturity, marital status, or even loyalty. For the medieval European context, the practice was rare, borrowed, and fundamentally focused on one bizarre visual goal: maximum contrast. In the medieval mind, a clean white tooth was not necessarily a sign of health or beauty. Sometimes it was seen as too common, too earthy, or even too wild. The aristocracy, who often suffered from dental decay due to their sugar-heavy diets, inadvertently normalized the look of darkened, imperfect teeth. But the common person, pursuing this extreme paleness, needed to ensure that nothing distracted from the ghostly white of their skin. A flash of perfectly healthy, slightly yellowed teeth, the natural color of bone, could actually make the carefully constructed white facade look dull or even grayish. The solution? Black out the smile. The techniques for achieving this darkness were as varied and unregulated as the facial pastes. Some methods involved chewing natural substances that stained the teeth dark red or black, like certain barks or berries. Others used a mixture of iron filings, vinegar, and ground oak galls, a kind of primitive, highly acidic black dye. This application was often permanent, staining the teeth deep black. It was a commitment. It makes perfect, albeit twisted, visual sense. When a person with a perfectly white face smiled,
The sudden dark void where the teeth should have been created an optical illusion. The surrounding whiteness of the face seemed to recede and intensify, making the pale skin look even starker and otherworldly. But wait, the common people of the Middle Ages didn't just stumble upon this aesthetic. There was a specific, if tragic, counter-narrative within Europe that sometimes necessitated this dark smile. The constant use of lead in cosmetics, as previously discussed, often led to the aforementioned lead line on the gums. This was a dark blue-black discoloration where the gum meets the tooth, an ugly sign of slow poisoning. This visible toxicity was a huge flaw in the desired aristocratic aesthetic. For some, the deliberate blackening of the teeth may have been a way to hide the discolored gums and compromised teeth caused by their lead-based makeup. It was a secondary cover-up, using a deliberate, extreme aesthetic choice to mask an accidental medical symptom. The deliberate dark camouflage became a new status symbol, a way to turn a medical failure into a visual statement. This obscure practice of tooth blackening is a perfect example of how easily the cultural logic of beauty can be flipped. Today, we spend small fortunes on whitening strips and brighteners. For them, spending time and effort to make the teeth look permanently absent or dark was the peak of fashion because it served the higher goal of emphasizing the white face. The dedication was astonishing. To commit to a life with a black smile simply to make the cheeks look half a shade whiter reveals a complete subjugation to a single arbitrary beauty rule. It shows that status is not about genuine beauty or health, but about visual obedience to the current cultural code. The black teeth and the white face created the perfect high-contrast portrait of medieval aspiration. They had perfected the facade, but they were about to accidentally discover the one thing their ancestors had always known, all along. Sometimes the natural way is the only way that works.
The white face and the dark smile represented the medieval person's desperate struggle against nature, a chemical and visual war waged on their own skin. But even in this era of toxic trends, nature occasionally slipped in to offer a genuine, if accidental, solution. Despite the focus on extreme whiteness, common people also stumbled upon lasting, effective skincare. This discovery was not made in the name of beauty, but in the name of survival and simple comfort. It was a necessity born from the sheer physical pain of their daily lives. The life of a commoner was harsh. Sun exposure wasn't just tanning, it was often severe burning, chafing, and windburn. The aggressive stripping washes they used, the vinegar and the lye, left the skin raw, inflamed, and desperate for moisture. The lead-based pastes, while whitening, were heavy, irritating, and led to inevitable breakouts. The face was in a constant state of low-grade trauma. When the chemical arsenal failed to soothe the inevitable consequences, the focus shifted from vanity back to basic, practical herbalism. They turned to the same plants and oils they used for cooking and healing. This accidental detour into real skincare was essentially a medieval first aid kit applied to the face. Simple herbal poultices and vegetable oils meant to soothe sun exposure provided moisture and protection, even if they were only used as a last resort. For soothing burns and general inflammation, common herbs like chamomile and calendula, which grew wild or in small gardens, were crushed, mixed with water or oil, and applied as a poultice. These simple pastes, intended to draw out heat and lessen the sting of the sun, were rich in natural anti-inflammatories. They were inadvertently providing genuine relief and repair to the stressed skin barrier. The use of simple natural oils was another accidental innovation. Lard and animal fats were used in the whitewash pastes, but they were terrible moisturizers.
When it came to actual healing, the common person often relied on basic vegetable oils. Olive oil, if affordable, or more commonly linseed or flax oil, or nut oils, were applied sparingly. These oils were not used for glowing skin. They were used to prevent the skin from cracking and bleeding after a long, abrasive day in the fields. They provided a crucial protective layer, a simple, elegant form of moisturizing that the poisonous, chalky pastes could never achieve. The goal was purely utilitarian, to prevent pain, not to promote beauty. But wait, there is a fascinating, almost poetic irony in this accidental skincare regimen. The nobles, obsessed with the latest imported tinctures and poisons, were focused only on the surface. They had complex recipes involving ingredients like mercury and mercury sulfide, which promised instant perfection but delivered long-term decay. The commoner, forced to rely on what grew around them, was instead tapping into genuine, sustainable skincare. The natural oils they used were high in essential fatty acids. The herbal poultices delivered antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. They were, without knowing it, practicing a form of phytotherapy that would later be rediscovered and celebrated in modern cosmetics. They were achieving real, deep skin health, while the elite were achieving toxic decay. However, the tragedy is that these genuine efforts were considered a secondary, necessary evil. The calming balm was applied at night, secretly, only to heal the damage caused by the morning's acidic wash and the afternoon's lead-based makeup. Health was merely the prerequisite for applying the next layer of poison. This accidental discovery of effective skincare was never formalized into a primary beauty routine. The vegetable oil was a medicine. The chalk was the cosmetic. The status rule, whiteness above all else, was simply too powerful to overcome. They knew the natural balms healed, but they also knew they wouldn't make their skin look like the high-status ghost of the manor. The medieval commoner had found the secret to healthy skin right outside their door, but they ignored it every morning in favor of the social necessity of looking permanently unhealthy. This cycle of self-inflicted damage, followed by natural remedy, became the rhythm of their daily lives. But the chemicals they were applying daily, even in small doses, were not content to simply stay on the surface.
The common person learned to heal the day's trauma with herbal oils, only to inflict new damage the next morning. It was a cycle of cosmetic injury and medicinal repair. But the true danger wasn't in the application itself. It was in the unseen environment created by these daily rituals. The chemicals used for beauty did not disappear when the sun set. They were not simply washed down a drain. In the small, often poorly ventilated medieval home, the lead dust, the acidic residue, and the ammonia fumes became a pervasive part of the family environment. The commoner's quest for whiteness was not just a personal habit, it was a source of household contamination. Imagine the scene. A small dark cottage shared by a family. The woman applies her chalky lead-dusted paste in the dim light. As she mixes the rough powder, tiny, invisible particles float into the air. When the paste dries and cracks, more particles flake off onto her clothing, her bedding, and the floor. The remnants of the whitewash didn't just stay on her skin, they settled into the domestic atmosphere. This was a forgotten, generational exposure that silently rewrote the medieval body's history. The greatest culprit was the cheap white pigment. Whether it was ground plaster contaminated with heavy metals or cheap industrial-grade lead dust, the substance was aerosolized every time it was prepared, applied, or removed. The lead dust would coat the surfaces of the home. It would be inhaled by the entire family, including children and infants who had no part in the beauty ritual but were constantly breathing the same air. This meant the entire household was living in a microenvironment of low-grade toxicity. The contamination was also transferred through direct contact. When the woman embraced her husband or nursed her child, traces of the lead-laden paste would rub off onto their skin. The child, crawling on a dirt floor dusted with lead remnants from the woman's clothing,
would ingest the heavy metal through their hands. This paints a much darker picture of the pursuit of beauty. The mother, desperate to elevate her social standing through her appearance, was unintentionally exposing her entire family to the very chemicals that were slowly making her sick. Her vanity was becoming a silent, shared family burden. But wait, the contamination cycle became even more complicated due to the nature of the other cleaning agents. The acidic vinegar and the ammonia-rich urine wash were also part of the problem. These chemicals weren't rinsed away thoroughly, often lingering on the skin and the cloths used for application. When those cloths were later washed alongside household linens in the same communal trough or pot, the chemical residues were subtly transferred. The family's clothes, the household's general environment, and the woman's own body became a continuous reservoir for these abrasive and toxic substances. This continuous exposure meant the body never truly had a moment to recover. Even when the woman was supposedly resting or healing with herbal poultices, the environment was quietly re-exposing her. The lack of understanding about airborne particulates and dermal absorption was the true tragedy. In the medieval mind, if a substance was washed off, it was gone. They failed to grasp the residual threat lurking in the dust motes and fabric fibers. This slow, cumulative familial poisoning explains why entire generations within these working communities often suffered from vague, debilitating symptoms that were simply dismissed as the difficulty of the age. They were attributing chemical toxicity to the hard reality of medieval life. The invisible transfer of these beauty chemicals turned the very concept of home on its head. It was not a pure sanctuary from the working world. It was a small, confined space where the hidden costs of social aspiration were constantly recirculated. The pursuit of the perfect white face created a domestic chemical legacy that lasted far beyond the lifespan of the makeup itself. The common people were not just sacrificing their own health for status, they were unknowingly etching the chemical history of their beauty habits onto the next generation. The final piece of this strange historical puzzle lies in what this silent struggle truly tells us about human desire.
The chemicals settled into the corners of the medieval cottage, turning the very air toxic. The quiet, daily beauty ritual was not just a personal choice, it was a silent, generational burden. The story of the pale face is, ultimately, a story about the universal, often absurd power of human aspiration. The common medieval citizen's relentless chase for a pale complexion highlights a timeless truth. The standards of beauty dictate behavior, creating a market for desire where effectiveness and safety are often secondary concerns. In the Middle Ages, the standard was paleness. It was a single, rigid, non-negotiable definition of worth. This was the social contract of the era, and everyone, from the queen to the chambermaid, was forced to abide by its terms. The extreme, dangerous lengths they went to, the vinegar, the ammonia, the lead, were all driven by a desperate desire to comply with the rules of status. The core lesson here is that when a society establishes an aesthetic that is difficult or unnatural to maintain, an entire black market of questionable and dangerous goods immediately springs up to service that demand. It is a fundamental economic truth that has not changed in 1,000 years. The medieval woman didn't care that the vinegar stung or that the paste flaked or that the lead was vaguely rumored to be bad. She cared about the visual result. She cared that for a single, fleeting hour, her face broadcast the message, "I am touched by wealth, not the sun." This is the legacy of simple, dangerous desire. It shows us that efficacy, meaning, does this product actually make me healthy or truly beautiful, is almost always ignored in favor of immediacy and visual status. The chemical burn and the slow poisoning were simply the accepted side effects of the only thing that mattered, the visual illusion of not having to work. think about the sheer, quiet determination this required. Every morning, the common person had to choose the pain and the risk of the homemade toxic pastes over the simplicity of leaving their face as nature intended. They were making a calculated, daily sacrifice of comfort and health for the slim, fragile chance of social advancement or, at the very least, avoiding social scorn. This story of the whitewashed face is a mirror. It forces us to look at our own culture and ask, what are the equivalents of the chalk and the lead today? What are the modern, unregulated, or questionable beauty trends we pursue, not because they are healthy, but because they are the current nonverbal signifiers of status and success? The tools have changed, but the fundamental human desire remains the same. The medieval woman was pursuing status with lead. The modern person pursues status with procedures, expensive ingredients, or restrictive diets, often ignoring the internal cost for the external look. The market that provides these things does so because it understands that desire, when driven by status, completely blinds the user to safety. The common medieval citizen, unknowingly participating in a massive public health experiment, left us an invaluable piece of microhistory. It proves that no matter how absurd, how painful, or how dangerous a beauty standard is, if it promises to elevate your standing in the eyes of society, humanity will always line up to buy the cheapest, most effective poison on the shelf. They were not just applying makeup. They were engaging in a silent, lifelong protest against their own station. And in that defiant, snow-white face, we can see the enduring, absurd hope of human aspiration. The sun still shines, the world still judges, and the pale masks have long since faded back to dust.